Welcome back, everyone. We've got a lot to cover today. International tensions, a really disturbing trial in France, and even some shakeups in the business world.
It's a full plate, that's for sure.
It is. So let's jump right in with Ukraine. It's back in the headlines, and not for good reasons.
Right.
The U.S. just took a controversial stance at the UN.
Yeah, siding with Russia on some of the resolutions concerning the conflict there.
And this, of course, has caused a lot of tension with our European allies.
Especially the UK and France, who have been pushing for stronger condemnation of Russia's actions. So this feels like a major shift in the U.S. approach to the war under the Trump administration.
Absolutely. And we're seeing the fallout from that. I mean, Macron and Starmer are actually in Washington this week.
They are. They're trying to bridge this gap, figure out how to move forward. It's a tough spot for Ukraine, too.
How so?
Well, there's talk of a potential deal. Ukraine would grant access to its mineral resources, some very valuable deposits, in exchange for continued U.S. support. And Zelensky, he sees this as crucial in the current political climate.
So they're being asked to kind of leverage their natural wealth for political backing.
That's one way to look at it.
It's a high-stakes gamble. What happens if they refuse?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And while all this is going on, we're seeing other European powers reacting in interesting ways.
Like Germany. The new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, he's been making some pretty strong statements.
What's he saying?
Well, he's been emphasizing Europe's need to become more independent, especially when it comes to security and defense.
Is that a direct response to the U.S. stance on Ukraine?
Some analysts think so. It's almost like he's saying, look, the U.S. under Trump may not have our back, so we need to be prepared to stand on our own 2 feet.
It's a bold move for Germany. But let's move on to a story that's really disturbing.
Yeah, the trial in France.
France is in the middle of its largest ever child abuse trial. Former surgeon Joel Lescornac.
Accused of abusing hundreds of children.
Hundreds. Over a 25-year period. It's just unimaginable.
It's horrific, and the way this all came to light.
Through his diaries.
Yeah, his diaries. Police say they contain detailed accounts of his assaults. This trial is expected to last for months.
It's absolutely chilling. And did they think there were signs as far back as 2005?
I know. The FBI even tipped off French authorities that he was accessing child abuse websites, and he got a suspended sentence.
A suspended sentence? How is that possible?
That's the question everyone's asking. It seems like there were systemic failures that allowed this to go on for so long.
It's a tragedy. And it demands a serious look at how to prevent something like this from ever happening again.
Absolutely. Victims groups are calling for an end to what they call the code of silence.
That allowed the abuse to continue.
Exactly. This case, it goes way beyond just one individual. It's a wake-up call for everyone.
Now, on a slightly different note, Pope Francis,
still in critical condition,
but stable in a Rome hospital, will continue to monitor the situation. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the ceasefire
between Israel and Hamas is looking pretty fragile.
Hamas is refusing to participate in any further talks unless Palestinian prisoners are released.
That was part of the agreement.
Right, so it hinges on both sides feeling like the terms of the agreement are being honored.
Exactly. It's a delicate situation. Can a ceasefire really hold when one side feels betrayed? This requires careful diplomacy, and it doesn't help that they have such a long history of conflict.
Absolutely. Speaking of tricky situations, Starbucks is making some big changes.
They are.
Trying to, revitalize its U.S. business.
Exactly. They're cutting 1,100 jobs, simplifying the menu.
What, like fewer choices?
Yeah, fewer but more popular items. Seems like they're trying to streamline, get back to basics.
Their sales been struggling, haven't they?
Yeah, especially in the U.S. So this could be an attempt to appeal to their core customer base.
Makes sense. What are they getting rid of? Anything I'd miss?
Well, say goodbye to the Royal English breakfast latte and the white hot chocolate and a few of the those super complicated blended frappuccinos.
So basically the stuff that wasn't selling well or was too much of a hassle to make.
Pretty much. They're aiming to shrink the menu by almost a third over the next year.
That's a pretty dramatic downsize. Now for some good news. Apple just announced a huge investment plan in the U.S.
Yeah, $500 billion, and they're promising 20,000 new jobs over the next 4 years.
That's massive. What are they planning to do?
It's multifaceted, but one of the key things is this new advanced manufacturing factory in Texas. They're going to produce servers there, servers that were previously made overseas.
So is this a response to President Trump's push to bring manufacturing back to the U.S.?
It's likely a factor, for sure. Plus, it helps Apple diversify their supply chain.
So a win-win potential.
That's the narrative, yeah. But there are questions about whether this creates an over-reliance on Apple.
What do you mean?
Well, if Apple were to face challenges down the line, could it make the U.S. economy vulnerable?
Interesting point. Always multiple angles to consider.
Always. And we should note the timing of this announcement, it comes right after Tim Cook met with President Trump.
So there could be some political motivations at play as well.
Possibly. Hard to say for sure, but the timing is interesting.
Now, on a somber note, we have some sad news from the music world.
Roberta Flack passed away.
Legendary R&B singer.
Known for hits like Killing Me Softly with his song.
She was 88 years old.
A true trailblazer. Her impact on music is undeniable.
Absolutely. Her voice, her songs, they resonated with people on such a deep level.
She'll be greatly missed. But before we wrap up, let's take a quick look at some other news happening around the globe.
Sure. What else is on the radar?
Well, the situation in Sudan. It's getting increasingly dire.
What's happening there?
The Trump administration's decision to freeze U.S. humanitarian assistance. It's had a devastating impact.
Wait, the U.S. froze aid to Sudan. Why?
They claimed they wanted to assess whether the aid was serving U.S. interests. They've since issued an exemption for emergency food assistance, but there's a lot of confusion about what that actually means on the ground.
So what's the reality for the people there?
Reports indicate that almost 80% of emergency food kitchens, the ones set up to help people affected by the civil war, they've been forced to close.
Because of the funding cuts.
Yeah. That means almost 2 million people who relied on those kitchens are now facing even greater hardship.
That's heartbreaking.
It's a very complex situation, but there's no denying that freezing U.S. aid has made things worse. A real reminder of how political decisions can have very real consequences for people far away.
Absolutely. A sobering thought. What other news are we tracking?
The situation in Gaza, that fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
Right, we talked about that earlier. Hamas refusing further dialogue until the Palestinian prisoners are released.
And now Israel is accusing Hamas of violating the ceasefire terms. They're calling the handover ceremonies for the released hostages humiliating and staged.
Oh, wow. So basically both sides are digging in their heels.
It seems that way. And it's important to remember, there are real people caught in the middle of all this. The people of Gaza, they're facing a humanitarian catastrophe.
With the ceasefire hanging by a thread, it's hard to see a clear path towards peace.
You're right. This situation desperately needs international attention and a real commitment to finding a lasting solution.
But for now, the future remains uncertain.
Very much so. Now let's talk about the recent German election and what it might mean for the global landscape.
Okay, what are the key takeaways?
Well, the victory of Friedrich Merz and his Conservative Party, it's definitely shaken things up. One of the most striking things is the surge in support for the far-right Alternative for Germany Party, the AfD.
They did well.
They doubled their support in just 4 years. They're the second largest political force in parliament now.
Wow, that's significant. What's driving that surge in support?
It's complex, but experts say there's a growing sense of unease among certain segments of the population, particularly in eastern Germany.
What kind of unease?
Concerns about immigration, economic inequality, a sense of losing traditional values, that sort of thing.
So the AfD is capitalizing on those anxieties.
That seems to be the case. Now, Merz himself, he's a more traditional conservative, and he's been openly critical of the Trump administration.
I see.
He's also been vocal about Europe needing to become more self-reliant, especially in terms of security and defense. So we might see some friction between Berlin and Washington under his leadership.
It sounds like he's walking a tightrope, trying to maintain a strong relationship with the U.S. while also asserting Germany's independence.
Exactly, and it'll be interesting to see how he manages that.
Definitely. To wrap things up, John Simpson has a thought-provoking piece.
He's been reflecting on the state of global affairs. He argues that 2025 could be a pivotal year, a year marked by profound and unsettling changes in the global order.
So he's saying we're living through a period of major upheaval.
That's his assessment. He points to the Trump administration's policies, especially towards Russia and China, as a key driver of this instability.
A sobering thought.
It is. Simpson believes that Trump's America First approach has weakened traditional alliances and emboldened leaders like Putin.
He's concerned about the U.S. retreating from its role as a global leader.
Very much so. He believes it could have far-reaching consequences for the world.
A lot to think about. And on that note, we've reached the end of today's Daily News Roundup. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, stay informed and engaged. It really does feel like, I don't know, a lot of these situations are coming to a head.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of. And the Middle East is a prime example. Things with Israel and Hamas are escalating.
Yeah, that ceasefire, it's hanging by a thread.
It really is. Israel's now accusing Hamas of orchestrating those handover ceremonies for the hostages.
The ones they called humiliating.
Exactly. They're saying it's a violation of the ceasefire terms,
And of course, on the other side, you have Hamas saying they won't talk until those Palestinian prisoners are released.
which was part of the original agreement.
Right, so it's this stalemate. Both sides are playing a dangerous game, and it's the people in Gaza who are suffering the most.
It's a humanitarian crisis unfolding,
Yeah.
and it's hard to see a way out.
Diplomacy is needed, but it's hard to find common ground when trust is so broken. And speaking of broken, let's talk about Starbucks. They're really shaking things up.
They are.
Yeah.
I was surprised by how many jobs they're cutting. And slimming down the menu, too.
They are. I think they realized they went a little overboard with all the options.
All those crazy frappuccinos.
Right. It got to be too much. They need to refocus, get back to what made them successful in the first place.
Maybe they're hoping for a return to simplicity. People are overwhelmed with choices these days.
Could be. It'll be interesting to see if it pays off for them. But, while some companies are scaling back, others are going all in, like Apple.
Their investment plan is huge.
Yeah.
$500 billion.
It's a massive bet on the U.S. economy. And of course, it plays right into President Trump's America First agenda.
Bringing manufacturing jobs back?
Exactly. But it does make you wonder, what if Apple stumbles? Does that put the U.S. in a vulnerable position?
That's a good point. It's a lot of eggs in one basket.
It is. And you can't ignore the timing of the announcement right after Tim Cook met with Trump.
Makes you wonder if there's a political angle to it all.
There might be. It's hard to say for sure. But anyway, let's switch gears again. This trial in France, the one with the surgeon.
It's just horrific. So many victims.
It really is. And the fact that there were warning signs, that the FBI even tried to alert French authorities, it's just mind-boggling.
And all he got was a suspended sentence. It makes you wonder if anything can truly protect children from predators like that.
It's a question that haunts this entire case. How can we create a world where this doesn't happen, where victims feel safe coming forward, and where abusers are held accountable?
It's a heavy question. And speaking of heavy questions, let's talk about climate change.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, isn't it? The science is clear, the impacts are real, and yet the global response has been so inadequate.
We talk a big game, but when it comes to action, we fall short.
It's a mix of political gridlock, economic self-interest, and just a lack of urgency from many world leaders. But the longer we wait, the worse it's going to get.
We're already seeing the effects. More extreme weather, rising sea levels.
It's a dire situation, but it's not hopeless. There's a growing movement, especially among young people, demanding change.
And new technologies are emerging that offer solutions.
Exactly. We need to harness that energy and innovation if we want to have a chance at a sustainable future.
Well said. Now, let's shift our focus to Africa. It's a continent that faces so many challenges.
Poverty, hunger, conflict, disease. It's a lot to bear.
But there's also so much potential there. We're seeing advancements in technology, entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. There's this vibrant energy, this spirit of innovation. But for it to truly flourish, we need to see improvements in governance, sustainable development, and empowering local communities.
It's about creating a world where all nations, all people have the opportunity to thrive.
Precisely. And speaking of thriving, let's talk about the new space race.
This time, it's not between nations, it's between private companies.
Like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, they're pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible.
It's an exciting time for space exploration. It's not just about adventure anymore, it's about economic opportunity.
And maybe even the long-term survival of our species.
It really makes you think about our place in the universe. Where are we headed? What kind of future are we creating?
It really is a fascinating time to be alive. So much change and possibility swirling around us.
It is. Hey, while we're on the topic of big questions, what's been happening in the financial world lately? Anything catching your eye?
Well, the cryptocurrency conversation continues. It's really interesting to see how it's evolving.
Yeah, it feels like it's moving beyond just speculation now.
Right. It's becoming more mainstream. More businesses are accepting it as payment. Even some governments are exploring its potential.
But there are still those who see it as a risky bubble.
Of course. And those concerns are valid. Volatility, regulation, potential for misuse. These are all things that need to be carefully considered.
But regardless of what happens, it feels like cryptocurrencies represent a pretty fundamental shift in how we think about money.
Absolutely. It's a challenge to traditional systems, and that always creates friction. Speaking of friction, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the U.S.-China relationship.
It's been tense for a while now.
Yeah, trade disputes, tech rivalries, geopolitical maneuvering, it's a lot.
It feels like a real clash of titans, a competition for global dominance.
It does, and the stakes are incredibly high. Any miscalculation could have serious consequences for the entire world.
So what's the path forward? How do we navigate this?
Well, diplomacy is key. Finding common ground is essential, but it's tough when both sides are so entrenched in their positions.
It's a reminder that even though we're often competing on the world stage, cooperation is crucial.
Couldn't agree more. We're all interconnected whether we like it or not. What happens in one part of the world affects us all.
It's a good point to end on. The world is complex, there are challenges everywhere we look, but we're all in this together.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of today's Daily News Roundup.
As always, thanks for joining us.
Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you back here tomorrow for more news and analysis from around the globe.